Hi listeners, and welcome to another fantasy animation footnote episode of the podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So in this instalment we're doing, I want to say the hero's journey, a hero's journey. I know of it, I've read a little bit about it, I know it's Joseph Campbell, but other than that, and it's obviously something that's, has come up when we've done episodes, certainly with practitioners, when they've talked about kind of narrative and sort of structure and thinking about story and thinking about kind of character development and so forth. I understand from my esteemed co-host that it has perhaps a particular connection maybe to fantasy storytelling, but we will discover that as we go along. So I will set the timer because I'm nothing if not consistent when it comes to format points, and we will go from here. So, hero's journey, over to you, Dr. Sargent.
Yeah, where should we start with this? The hero's journey is a term coined subsequently to describe a theory presented in a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces by a Jungian scholar named Joseph Campbell. And before we delve into the intricacies of the theory, if people have heard of this theory before, and they very well might have, it's because it's become extremely well known and very retaught amongst all kinds of minutiae of life. I know it's taught in, I think, at the English A level, English GCSE. There's an element of this when they do Introduction to Literary Theory. It is the basis of a lot of screenwriting manuals, and it's probably most famous as the text that supposedly inspired George Lucas when he wrote Star Wars. So it's seen very much within screenwriting circles, at least by some, as a kind of template theory for how to write the perfect story or a successful story.
So is this? So hang on. So is this a Campbell's piece? Is it a manifesto for how to write a story like this, or is it an example of a story like this, or is it a reflection on stories that are like this?
Very good question. It's a very good question, Chris. I think a lot of people, seem to think, he says, trying to be diplomatic but failing, that it is a manual on how to write successful stories, which it just demonstrably isn't. Before we even get into whether we agree with the theory or not, we must start with what the theory is. And the theory, it is not something that thinks about. It is not interested in the intellectual exercise of what a good and a bad story looks like. What it is interested in doing is basically providing a Jungian take on a kind of formalist, structuralist fashion. So let me break that down a little bit. For formalist structures, I think we did an episode on formalism or structuralism way back in the day. So see that podcast. But very briefly, it's basically an attempt to theorize what makes things work the way they work in art by breaking them down into their formal components, right? And there's loads and loads of examples of this, and they're kind of very popular around the sort of turn of the 20th century through to the sort of mid-20th century. There's a lot of Russian scholarship for various historical reasons around this kind of term. Vladimir Prop's The Morphology of the Folk Tale is one that I've cited in the past, which also does this exercise. So it's a structural formalist analysis, and that what it's interested in doing is breaking down stories into their kind of basic bricks, if you like. And then with those basic bricks, what Campbell wants to do a bit more than others, because he's a Jungian, and Jungian Carl Jung psychology is basically interested, or one of the things it's interested in that makes it quite distinct, in finding the kind of traces of our own unconscious mind in collective archetypes that surround culture. So an argument of a Jungian psychologist is that where there are repeated motifs in different stories and different kind of cultural artifacts, it is because these recurring things manifest certain anxieties, deep-rooted structures of the human mind. So Campbell is going through hundreds and hundreds, and thousands, hence the title The Hero with 1,000 Faces, of stories from a variety of different cultures, and he is trying to come up with a kind of what he calls a monomyth, a myth that explains all myths, or a kind of structure of how myths work based on his kind of commitment to Jungian psychology.
Okay, so is there, I mean, I'm assuming, well, I have a couple of questions. One, I'm assuming that there are certain criticisms, based on what you just said around the kind of monomyth, that there is this universal narrative pattern that transcends cultures. So there's probably an issue there with the all cultures are equal, some are more equal than others. How applicable is this thing when it's mapped across different parts of the world and traditions and stuff? And I guess my second thing connected to that with regards to fantasy is, has this found from your research into sort of kind of Hollywood, I guess, fantasy films, has there been, and fantasy scholarship more broadly, has there been a tendency by fantasy theorists to gravitate towards this sort of this theory? Because I've gestured to it briefly in a chapter in the computer animated film book, talking about narrative, but being very, okay, well, this is a classic hero's journey, and done nothing with it. So has it found, one, has there been criticisms of it, and two, is there a sort of a special relationship between this and fantasy?
Sure. So, question one: is there a criticism of it because like transposing this to other cultures? Yes. We haven't really got time to go into all of that, but yes, absolutely. Obviously, there is, because essentially what the exercise is trying to do is universalize. It's trying to say there are, if we look about what stories have in common, we can find universal structures. That argument is in itself open to criticism. Even if we don't engage with that part of the critique, which is, can stories be deduced to, can all stories be reduced to kind of individual bloke box, or does culture change meaning? Does it matter? Which is a big enough question. But if we put all that aside, I would suggest another interesting question to ask is, what does one actually learn by doing that? So for example, is it possible to find the same what's similar between a staple and an egg? Probably. They're both, objects that are capable of human touch. Did we learn anything about eggs and staples by doing that? Probably not. So an equal critique might be, what are we learning about stories by doing this? Which brings me to question two. Unfortunately, thanks largely to George Lucas, what we seem to have learnt is that this is how stories ought to be, rather than these are the findings of a anthropologist Jungian writing in 1949 about a bunch of stories they happen to have written about. And therefore, and because fantasy kind of has this relationship with folklore, in that it likes to draw on folklore, because folklore is the kind of only story that persistently likes to embrace the fantastic, certainly in the Western tradition, that we get this idea that fantasy must be written using the monomyth for it to work. So, which is odd, which gets us to the point where there's that really interesting paradox with fantasy. I think Brian Atterbury talks about this in his seminal, Strategies of Fantasy, of the genre that supposedly should give writers the license to be as free as possible to decide what they write about is often its most formulaic, and the hero with a thousand faces, the monomyth, the hero's journey is in part the reason why.
Right. Okay. So it's one of those things that kind of constrains as much as opens out with regards to fantasy potentially.
Well, yes, because people have taken it as a bible for how to write a story, right? Because I actually don't have an Well, I don't have as burning of objection to it from a kind of how can you do this in a kind of non-cultural specific issue, because I'm a theorist. Well, sometimes I'm a theorist. When I am a theorist, I'm quite happy to pause cultural questions, because that's kind of some of the point of theory. Not always, but sometimes, right? I am happy to live in a world where we can theorize outside of culture. The issue, so that other people might have those objections. My concern would more be, I'm not quite sure what story that the monomyth actually articulates. Because, like, you know, so let's actually break this down. People might have heard some steps of this, but it literally kind of takes you through step by step. He's quickly looking in the background here. Right, so, for example, I mean, this is the basics of the monomyth in 3 sentences. There's loads of different stages that some people have heard about. You might have heard, you know, the wise man calls, the road of travels, and all this sort of stuff. But the basic 3-sentence monomyth is: 1, a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. 2, fabulous forces are then encountered and a decisive victory is won. 3, the hero comes back from this mystical adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man.
So this is all Campbell. This is all Campbell.
This is all Campbell. This is all Campbell. So that's the monomyth in a nutshell, a 3-sentence nutshell, and it maps. You know, Todorov has a you know, the classic equilibrium, disruption, you know, status or whatever it is. Another kind of classic structuralist thing. But you know, fine. Let's read that again together. We could start questioning almost every single word in that. A hero. What if a story doesn't have a hero? Well, in a way, all stories have a hero, don't they? In that they all have particular agents of narrative causality. We could call Elphaba a hero in Wicked. We could call Darth Vader a hero in A Phantom Menace. You know, so what does a hero mean? Ventures from the world. What do we mean by the world? Of common day. What do we mean by that? And in a way, you end up getting a bit horoscopy with it, right? Which is that, like, of course, this applies to all stories if you let all words mean everything. But if you actually are a little bit rigorous about what words mean, none of it applies to a lot of stories, you know. So that's the kind of, if you embrace the mentality that all stories can be mapped into it, then they can. But I go back to my point about the stapler and the egg. I'm not quite sure what anything is achieved by doing that. We've run out of time, but my only thought was, it's interesting, and this is why I asked whether it was all Campbell. It's interesting that he's kind of using words that I would associate with fantasy, like wonder, and there are a couple of others that you mentioned as well. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So there's a kind of natural kind of bedfellows, which leads me into the final question, which is any scholarship that you've encountered on your travels that listeners might be inclined to read to get a greater sense of either the different steps, or there's a blog on our website that somebody's written about the kind of the call as part of this structure, but anything that you've encountered that we can stick on this website. Well, what I would say, I mean, there's loads. So I'm not, like, if I went through a list, like I would recommend, I would recommend people Google it. But what I will say, just as a kind of as an interesting place to go that you might not think to go, is it is actually very interesting that screenwriters use this as a theory, because it is very interesting that screenwriting is the one film craft profession that is actually quite open and interested in theories. You know, you don't get directors' manuals that cite Jungian psychologists very often, right? But screenwriting has this kind of strong history of trying to craft its own theory, you know, through the lens of looking at some other theorists, but trying to kind of write screenwriting theory of itself. So I would recommend, there is a really good book by Stephen Curran called Early Screenwriting Teachers, Origins, Contribution and Legacy, and it's about the kind of early history of screenwriting and the early introduction of teaching screenwriting, and how oddly that became the practice became interested in theorizing itself in a way that a lot of other slightly more kind of kinetic film practices are quite often not only don't theorize what they're doing, but actually openly hostile to the idea of theorizing. The Campbell phenomenon, even though I have objections to it, at least shows a kind of curiosity with theory that a lot of professions within the film industry don't have. So that there's interest in that in and of itself.
Great, and thank you for introducing the Campbell phenomenon as definitely a decent label for a John le Carré novel or something like that. So there we go. Stephen Curran, Early Screenwriting Teachers, etc. I'll put the link up. Great, there we go. Done and dusted on the hero's journey.
Listeners who have suggestions for future Footnote episodes can do so at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.